Hello, my name's Michael Kinsey, and in this talk, I'm going to talk about some of the ways engineers exhibit cognitive biases in technical design work, and some of the ways we might be able to mitigate them. A lot of the examples are based on biases and mitigation measures within fire engineering, but in theory, many of them can be applied to other forms of engineering also. The work was conducted by myself at Arup Fire in the Shanghai office. We have Max Kinniter from the NRC in Canada and Steve Gwynn from Movement Strategies in London in the UK. So your brain is an amazing thing. If you think about when we make decisions, there are so many more ways we can make the wrong or bad decision, but your brain is able to filter out a lot of noise and hone in on either the right decision or something which is good enough. And it does this almost effortlessly without you necessarily being aware of how you come to make the decision. Now, sometimes we can make mistakes in the decision-making process, and this can be for two main reasons. One is we have finite resources, so limited mental ability or information available, and limited time can impact that process also. Even if we have all of the time we need and enough mental ability and information, we can still make mistakes in the decision-making process, and this is caused by the way in which we make decisions, which can be caused by cognitive biases. Now, if we make mistakes in the building design process, the potential consequences can be disastrous. So the focus of this research we intend to address how engineers or fire engineers can make mistakes through cognitive biases in the building design process. Now, cognitive biases occur in decision making where information is inappropriately processed or overly focused upon at the expense of other or more relevant information, which can lead to an inappropriate decision being made. Commonly, this occurs when we're using something called the automatic decision-making system in our brains, which often happens non-consciously, but it can also happen consciously as well. And it can also happen quite often when we use heuristics, when we try to simplify a problem into something using a simple rule of thumb. Commonly, we see cognitive biases happen when we have too much information, we don't have enough meaning, so there's some level of uncertainty, we need to act fast, and we're not quite sure what we should remember. It's interesting to note that cognitive biases are extremely common, and you're likely to experience multiple biases every day, and you perhaps aren't even aware of it. So to give you a few examples, halo effect is a common cognitive bias. We see this perhaps in interviews when people dress well. The halo effect is whereby you think a positive trait of someone else or someone overspills and makes you act differently associated with something that's not good about them. So people dressing well in an interview, you might think, oh, they dress well, they must be good at this job, even though you have no other information to assess whether they may or may not be good at a job. Graduating a prestigious university, being good looking even, or being in a position of authority. Often if you see some of these traits, you're often more likely to think the person has a good trait in something, but you have no other information to back it up. Optimism bias is extremely common also. These range from believing it's okay to eat unhealthy food if you exercise after, due to an undue level of optimism. People are getting married and believing they won't get divorced, despite the divorce rate in the Western world being about 1 in 2. Smoking, believing they're less likely to contract lung cancer, and traders on the stock market believing they're less likely to be exposed to losses in the markets. By and large, as a race, as human race, we are naturally optimistic. So this can lead us to make incorrect decisions. So how can engineers make biased decisions? So we've based our research looking at general decision-making literature and identified potential cognitive biases which may occur in engineering. Many of the examples we've looked at are based around fire engineering, but they can be applied to other forms of engineering as well. And we've classified the types of biases into prescriptive code usage, modeling and calculations, and general fire engineering practice, and perceptions based on experience. So now I'm going to go through some of the cognitive biases that we've identified. So the first one is code authority bias, believing that a building designed in accordance with code, so prescriptive code, is safe due to being written by an authoritative governing body, or even in an authoritative manner, without questioning the suitability or the underlying assumptions for a given project. So this can occur. People just essentially people blindly follow what's written in a guidance document or code, saying that's what we should do because it's written down, just because it's in a position of authority. Closely related to this may be some other forms of code biases. So code risk aversion bias, choosing to follow prescriptive fire codes due to belief that they will reduce financial, legal and approvals risk. Quite often we might see this in a design team where they say, right, we don't want a performance-based solution, we want just follow the code because it's easier. And this can be due to an aversion of risk due to financial, legal or approvals. We also sometimes see code familiarity bias, perhaps in more senior members of staff. They're very familiar with many of the codes and the guidance documents, so they're more likely to follow it because that's what they're familiar with. They may have a belief that following the code is always the right thing to do because they're purely more familiar with it. We can also have code default bias. So this is utilizing the values or even utilizing the codes just because that's what someone has always done, and that may be appropriate a lot of the time, but sometimes it may not be appropriate. If we look at modeling and calculation biases, so using computational modeling like CFD modeling, evacuation modeling, structural modeling, quite often people will be trained up in probably one model, and then they'll choose to use that model all the time. So this is a default model selection bias because they're familiar with it. Maybe a company has an affiliation or experience or obligation to use a certain model. That's the model they will always use. But there may be more appropriate models that could be used for a given item of work. Whilst using the model, we may exhibit default value bias. So this is using the default values in a model or a calculation without questioning the suitability. A lot of the time models may be picked up and people just want to build the model and run it, and they perhaps don't consider if the default values are appropriate. We also have model familiarity bias. So sometimes we see this on projects where an approver may say, I want you to do your modeling in this model because I'm familiar with it. And it can be challenging to use a model that they've never seen before. So this is model familiarity bias. If we look at general engineering practice, design confirmation bias. So this is focusing on information which confirms an aspect of a design is correct or suitable, whilst paying less attention to the reasons why it might not be suitable. People who make a given design naturally inclined to want to defend what they've made, and they may have tunnel vision, not necessarily see all the things wrong with it. Engineers may also exhibit financial time or incentive bias, so they're conducting perhaps an assessment of the building design with less consideration of the negative issues during a project due to financial or time constraints. Maybe they don't have a lot of time, or they've been given a certain amount of money to actually complete an item of work, and this can create biases in some of the decisions they make. As engineers, we're involved in lots and lots of meetings, often big meetings, and often this means that we can experience meeting status quo bias. So the tendency to adhere to the current or accepted views of others in a meeting, despite having differing opinions. Perhaps someone is scared to shout up, despite everyone else adhering to agree to a certain course of action. We can also see staff authority bias, so being more likely to trust or follow the information of a senior member of staff due to them being in a position of authority and neglecting the validity of their information. So this may occur where we have a senior member of staff and a junior member of staff, and perhaps the senior member of staff is quite strong when they say things, and then the junior member of staff may just agree with them without actually thinking about the validity of what they're actually saying. Some more general engineering practice biases, some here more for fire engineering. So here we have fire probability neglect bias. So as fire engineers, we often focus on if a fire happens, or how do we stop a fire, and if a fire happens, what do we do? Now this may make us susceptible to neglecting the likelihood of a fire actually happening. Fires are incredibly rare, but we spend most of our time looking at the consequences of a fire. That we are more likely to think they are more likely to happen. past fire incident bias. So overly focusing on assessing a given aspect of the building design whilst neglecting other parts of the building design due to being a major contributing factor in a recent major fire incident. So for example, if you see a big major fire happen in your country or your region, and then it highlights a certain failing, you're perhaps more likely to focus on that failing in perhaps the current projects you're working on. And that's not necessarily a problem in itself, but if you start doing that whilst neglecting other aspects of the design, it perhaps can lead to some issues. We then might experience engineering or consultancy halo effect, so being inclined to trust the work of a given engineer, consultant, or even researcher due to the familiarity with them, and that may lead to less scrutiny of the work. So you may have an approver or a research body who says, these guys do good work, or they go to a good university, therefore I think I perhaps don't need to look at their work in so much detail. So this is a halo effect. A few more here for engineering practices. Engineering project planning optimism biased. So being inclined to think a future engineering project will not overrun in cost or time, despite experience of similar projects suggesting otherwise. I think this is probably extremely common in engineering. It's very hard to plan exactly how much time or how much money a project will need, and this can lead to optimism bias, and perhaps can result in loss of money on projects. We also have engineering project sunk cost fallacy. So continuing to conduct an item of work in engineering which is clearly not working or failing due to being heavily invested or committed in terms of time, money. This is another thing which is perhaps common, is when the more you work on a project, if the project is losing money or a number of challenges or issues are happening, the fact that you've invested more time means you're more committed to working on it, so you keep doing it without necessarily perhaps reflecting on what you might need to change. Finally, if we look at perceptions based on experience biases, for fire engineers, we have fire incident correlation illusion. So this is identifying a false pattern of failure from a series of past fires, given the incidents share a particular attribute, whilst ignoring the impact and interaction of other factors present, unduly simplifying the assessment of the incidents. So for example, if I saw a number of past fires that all happen in residential fires, I may say, right, the way we're designing residential buildings is wrong. But actually, if you look at the specific reasons why they had the fire and the contributing factors, maybe they're totally different. So we have to be careful about looking at fire incident correlation illusion. We also have fire incident hindsight bias. So often after a major fire has happened, often the reporters and news media will go and interview experts who will say, we could have foreseen this event happening because of X, Y, Z. Now that may be neglecting the information which was not known or unlikely to be known by the relevant stakeholders prior to the incident. So it's very easy after a fire incident to look back and say, oh, we could have known that. But actually, if you look at the reality of the situation, sometimes it's not possible. We have also research experience bias, overly focusing on the aspects of design which an individual has experienced. So this may occur where someone has past research experience or work experience in a certain area of engineering, and then they come to work perhaps in consultancy. And then perhaps they're overly focusing on those aspects of the design, which in itself is not an issue, but if they're doing that and neglecting other aspects, that can be a problem. We also have fire engineering survivorship bias. So believing the current process for conducting fire engineering in the building design process must result in a safe design due to a fire not occurring in a large majority of similar buildings, giving little or no consideration to the buildings where fires have occurred. So basically you're focusing on the buildings which have never had fires and thinking, look, they're okay. But actually, we should be looking also at the buildings which have had fires, the non-surviving buildings, as it were. So there are some cognitive biases that we've identified in engineering, and the list is by no means exhaustive or complete, but hopefully they'll highlight the fact that the cognitive biases are wide-ranging at different areas in the design process. So what can we do about it? So what we've done is identify or categorized a series of cognitive bias mitigation measures based on decision science literature, and they're broadly based into these 4 areas. So there's promoting bias awareness and conscious decision making, incentives, nudges, and procedures. Now, some of these may be adopted already, and some may be more relevant to specific decisions or even specific types of engineering. The types of decision engineers can make at different grades or levels can also vary and can influence the types of biases they exhibit. So mitigation measures subsequently may also vary depending on the grade of the engineer also. So for example, we know that more senior engineers typically work on more projects. They typically have to multitask much more, dealing with far more decisions, perhaps having to make decisions far more quicker. So that can influence the type of biases they may adopt, the type of heuristics or simple rules of thumb they use, and then the mitigation measures subsequently need to be tailored towards those. So if we look at promoting bias awareness, essentially if we make people aware that biases occur, then this can actually make people more likely to spot them during the design process and hopefully sometimes self-correct. Sometimes you can spot it in others, but often at times self-correction is a more easier way to address this. Now, the features of improving conscious decision making generally include awareness of the requirements of learning, so appreciating the need that you need to learn this, recognition of limitations of memory, not expecting people to necessarily remember everything, but to understand that there are limitations. Ability to appreciate perspectives, certainly it's perspectives that are not shared with you. The capacity to self-critique, so to look at why you might be wrong, and the ability to select strategies. So in terms of that, we have some examples here. So first thing is for promoting bias awareness is that you can just give training. So the fact that you're even watching this presentation gives you some training in the existence of cognitive biases. So I think most people can probably tick this if you're watching this now. Another way you can do this is to reduce time pressure. We know that if you make decisions with limited time or perhaps pressure, you're more likely to make a mistake, and perhaps more likely to use cognitive biases as well. So one thing you can do is try and reduce time pressure. So for example, if someone pushes you for an answer, you can say, actually, I'm going to need to go away and think about that. And this for engineers, consultant engineers in building design, this can occur definitely in different situations, but specifically in meetings. Sometimes it can be a better idea, instead of to give an answer in a meeting, to go away and think about something. Another way to promote conscious decision making is to verbalize what you're thinking. So talking out loud. Often when I'm talking with someone about a given decision, I'll just verbally narrate what I'm thinking without necessarily planning everything in advance. This can help you slow down making the decision and also allow others to see why you're making it. And hopefully that can promote you consciously thinking rather than making the gut-based decision making. Another way is to potentially make a cognitive biases checklist. So perhaps taking some of the biases that we've come up with in the previous slides and maybe adding some specific for your discipline, and then just going through thinking about if you've actually exhibited any of them. Incentives. So incentives refer to methods to encourage active thinking about a given problem through reward or punishment. They can also be used to incentivize people to spot mistakes as well. Generally, the value of the incentive increases with the associated value of identifying or correcting a given decision. A key aspect of any incentive is to upfront clearly define what constitutes errors in judgment in a given decision, so that everyone is aware of the rules of the game, as it were. So if we look at this, incentives can be grouped into rewards or punishment. So providing financial rewards, maybe a bonus, or giving extra annual leave when significant errors are identified in a project. The reason why this might be good is because often when people spot mistakes, it's often associated with negative connotations, and this is why quite often mistakes are not mentioned or highlighted or advertised, even because people are afraid it's an indication of failure, or possibly even if you highlight it with someone else, some level of treachery. So if you can start identifying mistakes with rewards, then it can help change people's mindset. Another way you can use incentives is through group dynamics and token incentives. So they often do this at schools where they group people into teams and provide points to people in each team when errors are identified. So like I said, at schools often you get groups of kids into different houses, and then you get given house points every time something good happens, and then you add those house points up, and at the end of the month, say whoever has the most house points will get a certain prize. We also have recognition, so celebrating projects which went well and also highlighting projects which didn't go so well through perhaps internal company newsletters. This is a good way because it incentivizes people to shout about the good stuff they've done, possibly also about the negative stuff as well, and they can be shared and lessons can be distributed within a company. Nudges. So nudges represent small, simple, and typically low-cost methods to guide or increase the likelihood of a positive decision rather than dictate a response, and mitigate potential biases. So nudges don't force a given decision. They try and push people to make a better decision. So nudges would typically be adopted where engineers make decisions for relatively small or routine tasks. They can also be decisions using reflective system or for larger tasks. So I've got some pictures here at the bottom. One is of a urinal, and what you can see here is a sticker of a fly. Now it's obviously not a real fly, and the purpose of this is that when a guy comes in a toilet and he sees the fly, almost instantaneously the guy, when he's going to the toilet, will think, I'm going to try and aim for the fly. Now, the intention of this is to reduce the amount of spillages onto the floor. And actually, they've done studies with this, and it actually does reduce the amount of spillages on floor. So the sticker of a fly doesn't force someone to not spill their urine over the floor when they're going to the toilet, but it does kind of incentivize them or nudge them into doing something. And it's also low cost. Another example is on the right, where you see a picture of a stair and an escalator. Here they wanted to try and increase the number of people using the stair because of the added health benefits. And the idea they came up with was to make the stair look like a piano. And the consequence of this is that when people see the stair and the escalator, they think, oh, I've never seen that before, I'm going to try and use the piano stair. So this kind of nudges people to use the stair, and thereby they get the added health benefits. So we can also perhaps use nudges in engineering as well. So here's a few nudges we've come up with. So in modeling software, one nudge could be to change modeling defaults to values which are either highly conservative or no modeling defaults at all. Now this will nudge people to change them. Now if no one changes your conservative defaults, then the values, your modeling analysis should still be okay. But hopefully they'll realize that perhaps they'll get an overly conservative result from the model, and they nudges them to change it. We can also look at reframing information, and this refers to changing methods by which information is communicated between people to promote better decision making and mitigate against cognitive biases. So in fire engineering, we often write fire engineering reports with all the requirements of different perhaps disciplines, and say this is what you need to do, this is why it's okay. But actually maybe we could be thinking about presenting some of the issues with your fire strategy, some of the potential high fire risk items nearer the top, so that it reframes the information to highlight some of the risks with the design. It also may be an idea, certainly in fire engineering, to consider severe but unlikely fire evacuation scenarios, which could cause what you've developed to fail. Again, this puts, reframing the information into, rather than a bias, this is why our design is okay, to our design is okay, but these are some of the things you need to think about. We could use commitment devices. So a commitment device is a way to oblige an individual into a given action that they may not want to do but is good for them. So there was a famous Chinese war general who, when he sent his troops into battle, he would line his troops up with their backs to a river. And this is a form of commitment device. And the intention here is that you either fight or you drown in the river. Perhaps on a less severe note, we could employ similar tactics within engineering. So one commitment device would be to create larger obstacles to temptations than the temptations themselves. So for example, maybe paying fire engineer fees up front before a project commences in order to mitigate against financial bias, so that you get a more objective view. enforcing minimum times to answer queries, so that we create so that people have enough time to actually make an appropriate decision without necessarily being pressured into making a given decision. Having an engineer make a publicized commitment to an action, so reputation could be affected. So this is perhaps through conducting third-party reviews, or we make all reports publicly available, so they're open to public scrutiny. Another thing is we could make monetary contracts to increase the benefit of a promise. So include bonus fees for engineering, a bit of engineering work, which is only paid maybe a number of years after a project is finished. So again, this creates a commitment device for doing good work. And if we look at procedures, so procedures represent measures which are adopted as part of standard practice with an organization to carry out specific process within engineering in order to mitigate cognitive biases. A lot of the previous examples that we've used could be considered procedural measures as well. So this is kind of procedures, kind of a catch-all for the other ideas of potential ways to mitigate cognitive biases. So the first one we've got is modeling checklists, adopting the use of quality assurance checklists within modeling to ensure aspects of the modeling process are not overlooked. This is hugely useful because often modeling is very complex, and there's lots of different facets, and on every project to ensure that you address all these issues can be challenging if you're just basing it on memory or more than one person's memory. So having a checklist is a really good way to make sure you're meticulous in checking off all the things that you need to do in an evacuation model. Encouraging questioning of senior staff. So it's important that you create an environment whereby the senior staff actually encourage junior staff to question them and not just to follow blindly what they say. We could also have automated checkpoints in software. So the software actually suggests, have you done this? Have you done that? Do you want to use the default values? So software developers in engineering have a role to play in this. Peer review and input checking is common, certainly internally, but also externally, to make sure that what you're doing is correct. Prescriptive code justification. So a lot of the time you may follow what's written in a prescriptive code or guidance document and no one will question it, but maybe we should start asking sometimes, why have you done that? Why is that appropriate? And this forces engineers to think about the justification rather than blindly follow prescriptive codes. Third-party fire strategy reviews, kind of along the lines of peer review as well. Mandatory fire evacuation modeling for large projects. So one procedure, maybe even if you follow the code totally, where you have a very large project, it may be a good idea to actually say we want to do evacuation modeling rather than just assume because we follow the code it's acceptable. So we're going to physically demonstrate a fire is not going to affect anyone whilst they're evacuating. Initial assessment. So this is when you have a certain problem and then as an engineer you think about the problem before you go talking to someone else. And when you talk to someone else, try not to tell them your idea initially. And the idea here is that you don't bias someone by saying, oh, this is what I think, do you agree? Because they're perhaps likely to just agree with you. So if you think of an idea of a solution, when you talk to someone, perhaps initially don't mention that idea and wait to hear their views first, so you don't bias their thinking. Another procedure could be devil's advocate project review. So this is whereby in engineering you do a project review where a team internally will present their project or a specific aspect of their project and they'll discuss it with their peers. So quite often if you're in a group, you can get groupthink where people are all very positive and want to support you, saying, oh, that's really good, blah, blah, blah. But what it can be a good idea is to have one person or maybe a few people say, you are the devil's advocate. Your job is just to tell us anything you can think of which is wrong with it. And this can make it more socially acceptable to talk about issues with a project. And here we have pre-mortem meetings. This is whereby again, another way to make it more acceptable to talk about failures of a given decision. You hold a meeting where, based on a hypothetical situation, you've chosen to go make a given decision, maybe a major decision on a project. And in this pre-mortem meeting, you say, right, say we chose this meeting, and 1 or 2 or 3 years after, it was found to be a total disaster. Why would it be a total disaster? And then in the meeting, your sole job is to all talk about why that decision was a total disaster, and be specific as possible. The idea here is that it tries to overcome decisions and groupthink bias, where everyone just states the positive views to support a group. So in engineering, this could be quite useful in various aspects, from bidding on a project. So you could say, we bid on this project and we did it after a year and then it failed. Why did it fail? Using performance-based analysis, or using a given material in the building design. There's a lot of situations where using pre-mortem meetings could be really useful. So in summary, we've talked about some of our research motivations, potential cognitive bias in engineering, and some of the mitigation measures. These mitigation measures, like the cognitive biases, are by no means exhaustive. Perhaps you can think of some of your own ways to mitigate cognitive biases in the decision-making process. It's also important to highlight that a lot of this work, or all of this work, it hasn't been specifically based on any empirical data collected within engineering itself. So adoption of any mitigation measures should be tested initially to identify if it's going to have the desired impact. If you'd like to know any more information, a link, a reference to the paper of the work can be seen in the link below. Thank you very much.